Last Thursday, I was in the middle of wrapping up work when my wife, Emma, called me to the door. Our neighbors, Josh and Lisa, had stopped by with a request. They explained that they were planning to install a pool in their backyard, but needed access for heavy machinery, excavators, bobcats and the like. The problem? Their yard didn't have enough clearance to allow the equipment to pass. Josh handed Emma a use of yard waiver, explaining they needed to use part of our yard to make the project possible. As I reviewed the waiver, it stated they required 10 feet of clearance, which meant 4 feet would spill into our property. Josh casually mentioned they'd repair any damage caused and reassured us it would be restored to its original state. On paper, it seemed harmless enough, but my mind immediately jumped to the irrigation system and internet lines running beneath the very area they wanted to use. Josh added that they were heading to Florida for a few days and would appreciate a decision within 48 hours. He tried to downplay the urgency, but the deadline added pressure. Emma seemed hesitant, and I could tell she wasn't thrilled about making a quick decision. That evening, I went outside to measure the area myself. Seeing how close it was to our system lines made me uneasy. I started to wonder how much disruption this could cause, not just to our lawn, but also to our utilities. While I wanted to help, something about the rushed request and lack of specifics didn't sit right. As I mulled it over, I told myself I'd call the pool company for clarity in the morning. Something about this waiver felt incomplete, and I wasn't ready to make a decision just yet. The next morning, I called the pool company listed on the waiver to get more details. After being transferred twice, I finally reached the project manager, a man named Kevin. He was polite, but seemed surprised that I was asking questions. Kevin confirmed that they needed at least 10 to 12 feet of clearance to bring in their equipment, slightly more than what was mentioned in the waiver. When I asked about the potential impact on the yard, he didn't sugarcoat it. To be honest, there's a good chance the ground will be torn up completely, he said. He assured me they'd do their best to restore it afterward, but his tone wasn't particularly convincing. The more I heard, the less comfortable I felt. My irrigation system wasn't new, and any damage to the lines could be expensive to fix. I asked Kevin if the company would take responsibility for potential damages beyond the grass, like the irrigation system or internet cables. That would be outside our scope, he admitted, adding that those risks were why they needed the waiver. As the call ended, I found myself torn. I understood the neighbors' need for access, but the lack of assurances made me hesitant. This wasn't just about some tire tracks on the grass. It could lead to more serious and costly issues. I decided to share what I'd learned with Emma later that day. She listened carefully, nodding as I explained my concerns. "Do you think Josh and Lisa even realize how much damage this could cause?" she asked. It was a good question. I wasn't sure if they fully understood what they were asking for, or if they just assumed we'd agree without hesitation. For now, I decided to hold off on a decision. I wanted to weigh the risks and explore all options before committing to anything. Saturday marked Emma's 30th birthday, a milestone I'd been planning for weeks. I was determined to focus on celebrating her, not the growing issue with our neighbors. The day started perfectly, a quiet breakfast at home, followed by a small gathering of close friends and family. Emma was beaming, and for a few hours, I managed to push the waiver entirely out of my mind. That calm didn't last long. In the middle of the afternoon, as I was setting up for the next part of the celebration, there was a knock at the door. I opened it to find Josh standing there, arms crossed and visibly impatient. "Hey, sorry to interrupt, but we really need an answer on the waiver," he said, his tone sharper than usual. Caught off guard, I explained that I hadn't made a decision yet. I mentioned the concerns about the irrigation system and the ambiguity in the document. Josh seemed irritated by my hesitation. "Look, it's just a piece of grass," he said dismissively, as if the matter was trivial. I tried to remain calm, explaining that it wasn't just about the grass. The waiver was full of typos, hadn't been notarized, and didn't clearly address repairs beyond superficial ones. Josh didn't seem interested in the details. "This is going to cost me thousands if I can't get this done," he said, his voice rising. When I suggested revisiting the waiver to clarify the terms, Josh threw up his hands in frustration. "Unbelievable," he muttered, storming off. I stood there for a moment, stunned by his reaction. I returned to Emma feeling guilty for letting the situation intrude on her special day. She brushed it off, telling me not to worry, but I couldn't shake the tension. The whole thing felt rushed, poorly planned, and now personal. As the evening went on, I forced myself to refocus on Emma and our guests, but in the back of my mind, I couldn't stop wondering, was I being unreasonable, or was Josh pushing me into something I'd regret? Sunday morning started quietly, and I was determined to put the situation with Josh on pause. But just after breakfast, there was another knock at the door. This time, it wasn't Josh. It was Kevin, the project manager from the pool company. Kevin introduced himself and immediately got to the point. "I wanted to see what we could do to move forward," he said, a clipboard in hand. His approach was professional, but I could sense an undertone of urgency. I reiterated my concerns about the waiver, explaining that I wasn't comfortable with the potential risks to the irrigation system and internet lines. Kevin nodded thoughtfully, flipping through some papers. "I understand your hesitation," he said, "but the area we're requesting is necessary for us to complete the job. We've done this kind of work before, and usually it's resolved without issues." That wasn't enough to reassure me, so I pressed him for more specifics about the repair process. Kevin hesitated before admitting, "Look, there's always a chance the ground might not be exactly the same afterward. We do our best, but we can't guarantee perfection." The conversation took a turn when Kevin mentioned something new, an electrical easement. According to him, there was a legal easement running 5 feet into my yard, right where they needed access. "If it comes down to it, we might be able to use that without the waiver," he said casually, as if this was supposed to ease my concerns. Alarmed, I told him I'd need to verify that claim. Kevin handed me a card and left, saying he hoped we could come to an agreement soon. After he left, I pulled out the plat design and deed for my property. I spent the next hour combing through the documents, searching for any mention of an easement. To my relief and irritation, there was no record of one in the area Kevin described. Now it felt like the stakes had risen. Not only was I dealing with pressure from Josh, but the pool company's attempt to leverage an easement that didn't exist felt manipulative. My resolve to stand firm was growing stronger. With Kevin's claim about the easement fresh in my mind, I spent the rest of Sunday diving deeper into my property records. I opened every file we had, plat designs, the original deed, and even the survey map from when we purchased the house. The more I searched, the more confident I became. There was no electrical easement running through the area Kevin described. The closest easement was for a utility box far from the spot they wanted to use. I couldn't help but feel a mix of relief and frustration. Relief, because I wasn't overlooking something that could force my hand. Frustration, because Kevin's casual assertion now felt like a blatant attempt to pressure me. Emma joined me at the dining table as I sifted through the papers. "Did you find anything?" she asked. I explained my findings, and her expression shifted from curiosity to quiet anger. "So they were just trying to bluff you," she said, her voice low but firm. I nodded, feeling a growing sense of mistrust toward the whole situation. It wasn't just the waiver anymore. It was the way this process had been handled. The rushed deadline, Josh's reaction, and now Kevin's misleading statement were all adding up. Still, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that refusing might escalate things further. I thought about the implications of saying no outright. Would Josh take it personally? Would it affect our relationship with the neighbors long term? I decided to sit down and draft a list of conditions under which I might consider signing. At minimum, the waiver would need to be revised, notarized, and include clear terms about damages to anything beyond the grass. If Josh and Lisa couldn't agree to that, I was ready to walk away entirely. For now, though, I needed to prepare for what felt like an inevitable confrontation. I wasn't just protecting my yard anymore, I was protecting myself from being taken advantage of. By Monday morning, the weight of the situation had settled over me like a cloud. I couldn't ignore the conflicting emotions swirling in my head. On one hand, I understood why Josh and Lisa were desperate. They'd probably sunk a lot of money into this pool project already. On the other hand, the lack of consideration for the risks on my end made me feel like my concerns were being dismissed. I took a walk around my yard to clear my thoughts, pausing at the spot they wanted to use. The morning sun highlighted the neat rows of sprinklers I'd spent weekends installing, a system I was proud of, because it made maintaining our lawn so much easier. I thought about the internet line too, remembering the hassle it had been to get it buried when we moved in. The thought of all that being torn up in a matter of hours didn't sit right with me. But was I being selfish? That question gnawed at me. The grass would grow back, wouldn't it? Maybe the sprinklers and cables could be repaired if they were damaged. I kept circling back to the waiver and how incomplete it felt. What if something went wrong and there was no recourse? Emma joined me outside, sensing my frustration. "You're overthinking again," she said gently. "It's not wrong to want to protect what's yours, but if you think there's a way to help them without putting us at risk, maybe it's worth considering." Her words made sense, but they didn't make the decision easier. I felt stuck between wanting to maintain a good relationship with Josh and Lisa and standing firm on what felt like reasonable boundaries. That evening, I sat down with Emma to sketch out my final thoughts. I wasn't ready to give a definitive answer yet, but I knew one thing. I needed to approach this with both fairness and caution. Monday night after dinner, Emma suggested I bring up the situation with a few close friends and family. "Sometimes an outside perspective can help," she said. I hesitated at first. I didn't want to come across as petty or overly cautious. But after everything that had happened, it felt like the right move. I started by calling my brother, Daniel, who had always been practical and level-headed. After hearing the details, he didn't hold back. "Look, it's your property. If you're not comfortable, you're not obligated to agree. Don't let guilt drive your decision," he said. His bluntness was reassuring, but it didn't erase the lingering doubt. Next, I spoke to Sarah, a close friend of Emma's who lived nearby. Her response was more empathetic toward the neighbors. "I get why you're hesitant, but maybe they're feeling cornered. Sometimes people don't handle stress well and come off as pushy. If they're willing to revise the waiver, it might be worth compromising." As the calls continued, the opinions varied. Some sided with Daniel, urging me to protect my property and stick to my instincts. Others echoed Sarah's sentiment, suggesting that I meet Josh and Lisa halfway to maintain peace in the neighborhood. By the time I hung up the phone, my head was swimming with different perspectives. I replayed the conversations over and over, weighing their arguments against my own reservations. Emma sat beside me, listening as I processed it all out loud. "You're not going to make everyone happy," she said. "The only thing that matters is whether you can live with the decision you make." Her words hit me harder than I expected. The truth was, no matter what I chose, someone would feel slighted, whether it was Josh and Lisa or myself. The question now was whether I was willing to risk the fallout from either side. As I went to bed that night, the decision felt heavier than ever. But I couldn't ignore the common thread from everyone I'd spoken to. Clarity and communication were key. I decided to draft my proposal the next day, one that I hoped would balance fairness with my need for security. Tuesday morning, I woke up with a sense of determination. The back and forth in my head needed to end, and I wanted to take control of the situation. I decided to draft a counter-proposal for Josh and Lisa, something that outlined my terms clearly and left no room for ambiguity. I sat down at the kitchen table, laptop open, and began typing. First, the waiver would need to be rewritten, removing the typos and vague language. Second, it had to be notarized to ensure it was legally binding. Most importantly, I wanted explicit clauses covering potential damage to my irrigation system, internet lines, and any other affected utilities. The document would also need to outline their responsibility for repairing the lawn to its original state. Emma reviewed the draft before I printed it. "This feels reasonable," she said. "You're not saying no, you're just setting boundaries." That afternoon, I walked over to Josh and Lisa's house to deliver the proposal. Lisa answered the door, looking surprised to see me. Josh appeared moments later, his expression guarded. "I've been thinking about your request," I said, handing Josh the document. "I want to help if I can, but I need to make sure we're protected too. These are the terms I'd need to feel comfortable moving forward." Josh scanned the paper, his brow furrowing. "You're making this a lot more complicated than it needs to be," he said, his tone clipped. "I get that it's frustrating," I replied calmly. "But this isn't a small ask. I have systems under the ground that could cost a lot to repair if damaged. I just want to make sure we're both covered." Lisa stayed quiet, glancing between us. Josh finally muttered, "We'll look it over and let you know." As I walked back home, I felt a mix of relief and tension. I had taken a step toward resolving the issue, but Josh's reaction left me uncertain about how they'd respond. For now, though, I had done what I could to meet them halfway. The ball was in their court. By midweek, I noticed a shift in the atmosphere around the neighborhood. I hadn't heard back from Josh or Lisa about my counterproposal, but their silence wasn't the only sign of tension. On Wednesday morning, while taking out the trash, I saw our other neighbor, Kelly, across the street. She waved me over and leaned in conspiratorially. "I heard you're having some issues with Josh," she said, her tone half curious, half gossipy. I wasn't sure how much she already knew, so I kept my response vague. "They've got a pool project and we're working through some details," I said with a polite smile. Kelly raised an eyebrow. "Well, they've mentioned it to a few people. Something about how you're making things difficult for them," she added, clearly fishing for more information. The comment stung, but I brushed it off and made an excuse to leave the conversation. As I walked back to the house, frustration bubbled inside me. It felt unfair that Josh and Lisa were framing the situation as me being unreasonable when I'd gone out of my way to offer a compromise. Later that evening, Emma and I decided to take a walk around the block. As we passed by another neighbor's house, the tension in the air was almost tangible. Normally, casual chats or friendly waves would greet us, but that night it felt like people were holding back. Back at home, I vented to Emma. "I'm starting to feel like the villain here," I said. "I've been careful, fair, and even offered a solution, but somehow I'm the one being painted as the bad guy." Emma placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "People will believe what they want to believe. The ones who matter will see you're just trying to protect what's yours." Even with her support, the realization lingered. My relationship with Josh and Lisa, and possibly others in the neighborhood, might not recover from this. The thought weighed heavily, but I reminded myself that I had done everything in my power to handle the situation responsibly. For now, all I could do was wait for Josh and Lisa's response and brace myself for whatever came next. By the weekend, I still hadn't heard back from Josh or Lisa. The tension between us remained palpable, and the uneasy quiet from their side made me wonder if they were deliberately avoiding me or still debating my proposal. Either way, the situation felt unresolved, and I was left with a gnawing sense of doubt. As I sat in my living room that Sunday afternoon, reflecting on everything that had happened, I decided it was time to share my story and get an outside perspective. I needed clarity, and maybe someone else could see something I'd overlooked. I started by recounting the events as objectively as I could, starting with the initial request and the rushed timeline. I explained my concerns about the irrigation system, internet lines, and the lack of clarity in the waiver. I mentioned how Josh had reacted when I asked for revisions and how the project manager had misrepresented the easement. When I got to the part about drafting a counterproposal, I tried to be transparent about my intentions. I wanted to be fair, I admitted, but I also needed to protect myself. It wasn't about saying no, it was about making sure there was accountability. I talked about the fallout in the neighborhood, how the situation seemed to have spiraled beyond just me and Josh. The whispering, the strained interactions, it all made me question whether I'd handled things the right way. By the time I finished recounting everything, I was left with one burning question. Had I done the right thing? So here I am, asking you, was I being unreasonable? Should I have signed the original waiver, even with the risks? Or was it fair to expect Josh and Lisa to meet me halfway? I want to know, was I in the wrong here, or did the pressure and missteps on their part justify my hesitation? Let me know what you think, because honestly, I'm still trying to figure it out.